Ago.
Amen.
Ago.
Amen.
In the tree language of West Africa, spoken amongst the Akan peoples, I've called your attention. Ago. You have assured your attention. Amen. We now pour libation for our ancestors who have laid a path of achievement and struggle for us to emulate. A libation is an offering of water or wine or spirits to our ancestors, calling on their strength and guidance. In many traditional African societies, no occasion shall commence without libation. I will make a declaration. You will affirm the declaration with a response of your choosing. You may say, Ashe, Yabo, Inshallah, Amen, right on, or any other appropriate response. Let us begin. We will not bow down to injustice.
Yes,
We will not bow down to racism.
yes,
We will not bow down to exploitation.
yes,
We will rise.
right on,
We will rise.
right on,
We will stand.
right on.
Madasi. Thank you. Peace.
Good morning. This is the LBJ School and the Center for Study of Race and Democracy's inaugural Juneteenth Summit. We're fortunate to have Dr. Benil Joseph leading this effort. He's a professor at the LBJ School and one of the world's premier thought leaders and scholars on race and democracy. The LBJ School has a long legacy of studying and shaping social justice and civil rights, which began with its founder, namesake, and a Texan, President Lyndon B. Johnson. Research at the LBJ School around equity includes studying Black entrepreneurship in rural cities, the root causes of poverty, the importance of oversight of our criminal justice system, investments in workforce development, and equitable access to internet technology. It's natural that the LBJ School is hosting this Juneteenth event. Juneteenth commemorates the end of slavery in the United States, when federal troops informed enslaved Black Americans in Galveston, Texas, of their freedom on June 19, 1865. Over 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Juneteenth is not only Black history, it's American history. This day represents a new birth of American freedom, both historically and in our own time. Juneteenth, already recognized in the state of Texas, is becoming a national phenomenon and a way for all Americans to listen to the voices of Black women and men who helped build American democracy against long odds. Thank you and enjoy the summit.
Thank you, President Hartzell. Welcome to the inaugural Center for the Study of Race and Democracy and LBJ School of Public Affairs Juneteenth Freedom Summit, Birth of a New American Freedom. We have an impressive lineup of leading voices and thought leaders. Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed, Brett Hurt, João Paulo M. Connolly, Lawton Cummings, Dr. Kefferlin Brown, Dr. Rich Reddick, and Mayor Sylvester Turner. We'd like to thank our outstanding sponsors for their generous support. Data.World, the world's largest collaborative data community, believes that diversity leads to the most creative discussions, ideas, and outcomes. Notley, providing knowledge, collaboration, and capital for the social impact community. We are also a proud member of Notley Tide, their grassroots efforts to amplify the voices of social justice organizations in Texas and nationally. And IBM Diversity and Inclusion, which has a rich history of diversity and inclusion dating back to 1911. This month marks IBM's 1-year anniversary of Embrace, established to drive monumental internal and external progress around representation and transparency, creating economic opportunities, leading in good technology, and social justice policy advocacy. Thank you for joining us today. we hope you enjoy the program. And I'd like to say that Juneteenth has long been a Black American tradition that answered the question that Frederick Douglass asked in 1852, what to the Negro is the 4th of July? Juneteenth, as the birth of a new American freedom, was the response. Black citizenship and dignity went hand in hand with the founding ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Juneteenth reminds us that we have a shared national history and offers us an opportunity for a unifying vision of both the American past and the present, one that focuses on how to achieve a country that is as good in reality as the ideals that it expresses on paper. We hope that you enjoy this inaugural event and that we can see you in person next year. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mayor Sylvester Turner, Mayor of the City of Houston. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this wonderful and important Juneteenth Summit. The work being done by both the LBJ School of Public Affairs and the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy is vitally important, and I am honored to be included in this program. If you ask me, Juneteenth is as important to the story of America as the 4th of July. The Emancipation Proclamation may have unlocked the door, but it wasn't until the slaves here in Texas were released that the United States could say as a nation that Black people were free. For 8 years, I have hosted the annual Acres Home Juneteenth Parade, bringing together the community to enjoy bands, floats, and other unique entries. We canceled this year because of the pandemic, but I look forward to holding the commemoration of freedom again next year. The celebration has felt a little different since my dear friend, Mr. Juneteenth himself, the Honorable Al Edwards, died last April. Al was a fighter, he worked tirelessly for his constituents, and he led the charge in establishing Juneteenth as a state holiday. He fought an uphill battle with considerable opposition to ensure that the state of Texas recognized the importance of that day in 1865 when the Emancipation Proclamation was read in Galveston. But of course, our work is not finished. We see examples of racial injustice and inequity on a near daily basis, and it is our duty to call them out and hold those in power accountable. Join me in celebrating this Juneteenth as we recognize that the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness apply to all.
All right, I'm so pleased to be in conversation with two of my distinguished and dear colleagues, Dr. Kefferlin Brown, who is professor and distinguished university teaching professor of cultural studies and education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Texas at Austin, and Dr. Richard Reddick, who is a professor and the inaugural associate dean for equity, community engagement, and outreach in the College of Education. So Dr. Brown and Dr. Reddick, thank you for joining us for this Juneteenth celebration.
Glad to be here.
So Dr. Brown, I'm going to start with you because you're a national renowned expert in K through 12 curriculum implementation, pedagogy, instruction, facilitation. How could we implement the study of Juneteenth and that history that it's connected to, both of racial slavery and Reconstruction, in a K through 12 curriculum?
Well, I think, first, thank you so much for having me. I guess I'm going to answer this question really simply. We can add it to the curriculum. We can actually teach about the presence of slavery, how it played out in Texas and what led to the Juneteenth holiday or the designation. I grew up in Texas. I attended Texas schools. And while I knew about Juneteenth because of my family and the community where I lived, the city had celebrations, I did not learn about Juneteenth in school. I don't recall learning about it at all. So I think at a basic level, we need to add it to the curriculum. And given the fact that it has taken on a national sort of identity, states, multiple states across the United States have picked it up and have decided that it's important to celebrate it. And I think we need to have it not only in our Texas history, but it needs to be in our national curriculum, the history of the U.S., not national curriculum, but the history of the U.S. in the curriculum that's taught across all of the different states.
Great, thank you. Dr. Reddick, I want to ask you about higher ed and how can we, especially at the University of Texas at Austin, implement the study of Juneteenth in a holistic way in the curriculum, because it seems to me it means a lot to this university and this city, this town, this state.
I would actually echo a lot of what Dr. Brown said, because it is about, I remember being taught, also being a Texan and going to school in the state of Texas, not really understanding Juneteenth and its significance until I took history classes with Dr. George Wright here at UT Austin. And we shouldn't be waiting until it happens at the university level, but certainly at the university, we've got an obligation to be forthright about the institutional, our connection to this, because the University of Texas is founded only 18 years after the Juneteenth proclamation by General Granger. So that's significant. It's very closely tied to our own institutional history. And the fact that we have leading historians like yourself and others on campus who integrate this into your teaching. And first of all, talking about the issue that we are celebrating an actual delay of information, right? That's significant to talk about. And also, I think something that we should also talk about, the fact is that making sure it is a campus-wide recognition that is not overly burdened on Black folks or folks of color to explain what it is. If people are watching this and saying, what is Juneteenth exactly? It's a great chance to go online. And in fact, I would recommend a piece that Elie Mystal just wrote in The Nation about the miseducation of white children. This is the problem with sort of omitting uncomfortable or pieces of our history that aren't clear, because we don't get a chance to expose ourselves to what actually happened. And then we're left in these awkward situations. We have to kind of go back and re-educate ourselves, or worst case scenario, people actually overtly denying the reality of the history. So to me, it's the same thing that Dr. Brown said, but we have an obligation, I think, especially to not just keep it as a campus conversation, but to expand into the community as well as part of our mission as a public flagship university.
And Dr. Brown, in this past year of racial and political reckoning after George Floyd's murder, there's been so much interest in Black history and the study of Black history that what we've seen in 2021 is a real pushback by conservative, by right-wing forces, including right here in our own state of Texas, of a pushback of studying African-American history in Texas history. This assault on so-called critical race theory, which is just this, the folks who attack critical race theory don't know what it is, and that it was a subfield of critical legal studies that just said race was a constitutive element of the law and should be studied as such. Derek Bell, Patricia Williams, Kimberly Crenshaw, and not everything that is Black history is actually critical race theory, but that has become the shorthand to attack and disparage that. So one, why those attacks? And two, what can we do to overcome that? Because I think of Juneteenth as something that's very unifying for all Americans, that having these hard talks and hard conversations creates critical thinking students, irrespective of color, and will help us build a kind of civic and civil society towards justice and equity that I think most of us want.
Well, I'd say that First off, the curriculum, and here I'm talking specifically about what we would consider the formal curriculum, the curriculum that students are expected to learn and that teachers are expected to teach. Students will be tested on that curriculum. The formal curriculum has always been a site of debate and contestation and controversy with different elements, different political elements attempting to control what goes into that curriculum.
And why do they attempt that control, Dr. Brown? Like, why is it?
Because the assumption is that, quite simply, knowledge is power, or the belief that what students get exposed to, what they learn, is going to play a role in how they look at the world and how they'll eventually act in the world. Very similar to what Dr. Reddick said. It's not uncommon for students to come into our classes in the university and to say, when they encounter histories or knowledge that they had not been exposed to before or previously, why didn't I learn about this in K-12 schooling? And they just ask those questions. And it makes sense why they ask those questions, right? Because there are certain perspectives and knowledge that have been left out for a variety of reasons. And I think an important reason is around issues of power. So when you ask, why do we have these challenges now, I think for the very reasons that you laid out, that we went through an intense period in our country around sort of a racial reckoning, where the vast majority of people actually saw, right in living color, they were able to see racism, racial violence, anti-Blackness play out in such a way that it could not be rationalized away as something else other than what it was. And many people felt like they needed to know more about that, and they wanted to know more about race. And as we saw more people talking about race and the need and the desire to learn about race and the desire to address this in K-12 curriculum so that we don't raise another generation that's lost or that doesn't understand race and racism, we start to hear more conversations taking place in schools and in our society. And that can ruffle the feathers of those who are not interested in having those conversations or not interested in having more people. And in this case, I would say really more white people acknowledging racism. My sense is that this is similar to what we probably saw. I wasn't alive during the heyday of the civil rights movement, but I imagine that some of what people experienced when they saw on television the violence that was taking place in the midst of a movement that was decidedly peaceful, right? That stirring of the consciousness of a large group of white people who hadn't really realized or just hadn't accepted what was going on, and they said, no, there's something that needs to be done. We got to do something. And that gets people who are not in that same mind frame nervous. And I think that that's what we're seeing now. I think the success of conversations around race and racism, or the perceived success and effectiveness of those conversations, is what's leading to this ubiquitous assault on racism that's playing out with critical race theory that many people don't even really understand what it is.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Brown. Dr. Reddick, and we're unfortunately running out of time, so I'm going to ask you to be brief, Dr. Reddick. How can, when we think about University of Texas and handling Juneteenth, how can we protect Black students and Black faculty and Black staff from the cultural taxation of having to sort of teach this to their white and other counterparts, even though it's not necessarily their job to teach it? I'm not saying the faculty who are going to be teaching it, but just holistically. A lot of times students, especially during this last year, and faculty, including faculty leaders such as yourself, have felt that burden of having to do not only their job, but having to do even more, go way, way beyond 27 different committees, literally 27 different committees to try to help in terms of diversity, equity, racial justice. How can we talk about Juneteenth here at University of Texas without taxing Black folks extra?
Well, I think about something that I heard Dr. Brown sort of allude to, and that's the fact that, we have access to such great information now. Because Juneteenth has become a national moment of recognition, a number of national organizations have founded websites, informational spaces that people can actually access themselves. And so I kind of think about it as the same way you would do a workout, right? Part of the work you have to do is work you do on your own, right? So I think if we take the responsibility and acknowledge the fact that perhaps we come from educational experiences that were incomplete in some ways, and to take on the responsibility of doing our own work to figure out what are the gaps, right? Using those resources and then accessing all the publicly accessible pieces that are available. One thing I've heard from faculty over the years is that there's a stress in teaching these topics when you are talking to people who are resistant. They don't believe what you're telling them. They doubt what you're telling them. They've never heard it before. So if we know that's happening already, part of the challenge is to realize that probably all of us have gaps in our knowledge, and we should take the responsibility of filling it ourselves. Once we have done that, we can really benefit from having those discourses and those engagements with our faculty leaders, our community experts, which is another thing. The university is not the only place where this knowledge resides, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are great community resources about Juneteenth. The city of Austin has a Juneteenth celebration, as does Houston, as do most cities in the state of Texas.
Well, I'd love to talk to you both more about this issue, but thank you so much. We've been talking with Dr. Kefferlin Brown and Dr. Richard Reddick, both of the University of Texas at Austin, about Juneteenth and the pedagogical parameters of Juneteenth, both in terms of K through 12 curriculum and instruction, but also in terms of higher education here at the University of Texas and nationally. I think education is such a huge part of this moment of racial and political reckoning with respect to social and political justice for both Black Americans and all people. And so it's been great to have this conversation with leading educational experts. These are scholars who have devoted their whole lives to looking at how do we implement educational equity, both in terms of K through 12, but also in terms of higher education. And how does education impact us as professionals, as scholars, as practitioners, as staff, as students, and then how does it impact different democratic institutions in American society? So when we're discussing Juneteenth, we are talking about American democracy, who gets to interpret American democracy and why, who gets to be a citizen, who gets to have dignity, and who doesn't. And what we remember from those who were around during Juneteenth, the Black folks in Texas, they strived for dignity and citizenship for all people. That's what we have to remember. The reason why Black people are so important to this country is that they have expansively reimagined American democracy, not just for themselves, but for everybody. And that's the fight. They continue that fight in the 21st century. So Juneteenth is not just for Black people, it's for all Americans. And it becomes in certain ways more important than the 4th of July, because the 4th of July is a holiday celebrating freedom while there was still racial slavery in the United States, and while women still didn't have the right to vote, and while Native American people still were not citizens. So Juneteenth brings us closer to Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of a beloved community, I would say, more than any other holiday in American history. So thank you, Dr. Brown and Dr. Reddick, so much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Dr. Joseph.
Thanks.
It's my pleasure to be in conversation with my friend and who's a thought leader, an attorney, very successful, a partner at Notley, and really the creator of Homefront, this Juneteenth to talk about housing and how really folks who are venture entrepreneurs and venture capitalists can invest in equity on the housing front. So Lawton, thank you for speaking with me today. And what is Homefront, your nonprofit that you founded that's really making an impact here in Austin?
Well, thank you for having me. It is always a pleasure to talk with you, and I'm honored to be here. So at Notley, we are an engine for social good. We invest in traditional investments like real estate and CPG, and then we use a portion of those funds to support our community efforts. And then we invite in community members to invest along with us in social change. When I joined Notley, I could see that we had this incredible affordability crisis, really, I could say looming, but it was already in process. And this was before our real estate market just went bananas in the past year. But we have a lack of good public transportation. So people have to drive for hours and hours to get affordable housing. We have a real problem with inventory for affordable housing, and we have food scarcity issues. Mm-hmm. So I co-founded Homefront with my partner, Dan Graham, and it was to address this affordability issue in Austin.
And what does Homefront do? And in doing what you do, how are you setting a model for folks to invest in issues of racial justice and equity right here in Austin?
Well, when the pandemic hit, we really had to pivot to focus a lot on homelessness and food scarcity, and actually on community pods for kids. So we started a chapter here of Get Shift Done, which was we paid out of work hospitality workers from donated funds to work at food banks, because the food banks were experiencing 300% increase in demand, and most of their volunteers were retired and afraid of COVID. So this was really a matchup. Then the kids started going back to school online, and the wealthy parents were putting their kids in pods with teachers, and those who really needed it didn't have access. So we started a community pods program where my partner Tala started that, and kids of any income, but we were really aimed at free and reduced lunch. It was mixed stage, and we provided them meals, we provided them teachers, security, internet, and we ran that until the schools went back in session. On the housing front, we have not only a ballooning problem with affordability. In fact, I don't know if you saw the stats, but the median home price went up 32% year over year. And that just came out in April. So people who were already having problems paying their rent and finding affordable housing are now completely priced out of the market. And what I saw early in the pandemic in the housing situation was that our homeless shelters overnight became completely unsanitary because they're congregate. And in fact, it's just they serve a very small portion of our unhoused community. There's currently about 150 beds downtown, and our stats are really bad for congregate shelters in general. People who go in, spend the night, they go right back out onto the streets the next day. There's no pathway, there's no exit. We were really having a problem here with convening. We had people were siloed off and trying to do their own thing. The chamber was people, well-meaning people, well-intentioned people, disagreed on how to proceed. And so it led to stagnation. So my dear friend, Lynn Meredith, who cares deeply about this issue and is on the board of ECHO, which is our umbrella homelessness, I guess you would call it an umbrella. They distribute HUD funds, and they also collect information. And we got that CEO, the mayor, the Chamber CEO, the Downtown Austin Alliance CEO, and we all came together into a room, and the city manager, and said, let's agree on how to move forward. Let's raise money from the community. Let's leverage dollars from the federal government and from the city. And we're currently putting together a local government corporation, which will administer that and collect better data. On the affordable housing front, one thing I've really learned throughout this work is that both in homelessness and affordable, actually, there's a real racial inequity that was created systemically, as we know, but a lot of people may not realize that it was created with intention. I went back and learned that in 1928, the Austin City Council came up with a plan for our city in response to the Southern doctrine of separate but equal, whereby the communities of color would be moved out east so that there would only need to be one separate Black school, one separate Black library. So
segregation, basically.
Exactly. Whereas prior, I mean, as I've heard you speak about, prior, we really had some integration throughout the city. We really did.
Well, especially in the Clarksville area, we absolutely had racial integration. Blanc and I could talk to you about these issues for a longer time. Unfortunately, our time is limited. I want to thank you for the work you're doing. I want to encourage everyone to check out what Notley is doing, Notley Tide in this space, Homefront. This is an example of the Silicon Valley here in Austin, investing in racial equity, investing in social justice, walking the talk. Housing affordability should be a civil and human right for everyone. And we're trying to make that happen here in Austin. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I've got the pleasure to be talking to Joao Paulo, who's the Director of Housing and Community Development at the Austin Justice Coalition. Joao, thank you for joining us for this conversation.
My pleasure to be here.
What is your role? What do you do? Your advocacy, your social justice role as Director of Housing and Community Engagement?
There's been several kind of major policy questions, changes in the city, and we've been focusing on weighing in on them and trying to motivate community members, folks from Austin's, from East Austin, from Austin's Black and Brown, historically Black and Brown and gentrifying neighborhoods to weigh in on these questions, and also thinking about how we can really direct the conversation to a transformative place towards making Austin more inclusive, more accessible, more racially just and affordable city. So some of these major questions involve questions around transit, Austin's giant new transit system, Project Connect, questions around zoning and land use, questions around building housing for folks experiencing homelessness in our community. So some of these major big conversations that are taking place so that's been a huge part of what we've been working on over the past 2 years, and it's been busy. It's been busy years.
Well, since you're an expert on housing and the way in which it's connected to issues of equity, I think a lot of people don't understand. I want you to tease it out for us because you mentioned several. But why is housing such a huge, important, sometimes people say the most important civil rights issue and human rights issue that the nation is facing? I'd love for you to tease that out, and you could take some time in terms of, you talked about infrastructure. I know housing is connected to food justice and education and mental and physical health and well-being. So why is housing so important?
Thank you. First of all, I'm a little scared of being called an expert, but we do spend a lot of time thinking about these things and working on these things. So definitely very passionate about them. I think housing it goes back to the very early parts of the history of this city, and even earlier in this country. It speaks to questions about community, questions about territory, space to exist, space to share life with friends and family. And it speaks to access, who gets access to opportunities, who gets access to resources that are available. So many different questions are connected to housing. And for instance, just to make it more tangible, Texas has experienced rapid influxes of population, rapid growth and change. And the Texan model for new development has primarily been sprawl, outward expansion of the city into new sprawling suburbs that don't end. And that has tied in very closely with gentrification and displacement, where we see that lower income folks, working class people, people of color are constantly pushed out to the margins. Sometimes this is called the Great Inversion. There was a time when the urban cores of cities were predominantly working class and people of color and lower income, and now those through gentrification, through processes of economic redevelopment, that has transformed itself. And so now people with less opportunities, with less access, working class people are constantly pushed further and further and further away from the core. And I mean, this is most strikingly true about Black and brown folks in this city, in Austin. And then you brought up food justice, right? Because the further out people go into these new suburbs that are created, and there are several of them just sprawling at the outskirts of Austin and Travis County right now, the further they are from food, from grocery stores, from access to work, the longer they have to wait in transit and traffic in order to get to their job sites and all of that. One striking example of that is a lot of the construction workers who are building a lot of the new infrastructure and buildings and a lot of the new transit stuff that is getting built in downtown Austin right now are Latinos, brown workers who do not have any alternative other than to drive their cars into the city, and then they have to pay their own parking costs and their own gas fees, and it's a huge slice. And they're the ones building all this infrastructure, and a huge slice of their incomes go to paying for the expenses to get to the job site. So,
Joao, yeah. I want to
please stop me. Yeah,
I want to come in there because I think that I have a question about, and I know Eric Tang has done great work here. How is the history, and this relates to what you were just saying, the racial imbalance of you've got these Black and brown workers who are working on projects that they're really not going to have a chance to enjoy as sort of consumers. How is the history of racial segregation in Austin historically? We think about the 1928 master plan. How does that impact us now as we are looking to create more equitable and really more, I would say it's a few things: housing affordability, transform homelessness, and also home ownership, so we can have generational wealth and equity in this city. So how is that history, that past history of racial segregation that is now a present contemporary history of racial segregation, how's that impacting housing affordability in the city of Austin?
I mean, the city of Austin, I haven't been here for too long. I've been here for 10 years now, and the research I've done and the work I've done from people who know so much more about this, like Professor Eric Tang, but the history of Austin, the entire built environment of Austin has been shaped by segregation and by this Jim Crow legacy that is constantly perpetuated. And part of that philosophy, there was the 1928 master plan, as you mentioned, and then, the use of highways like I-35 and MOPAC to displace communities of color and to further enforce segregation. But even more recently, and coming up into the 90s, as the city created its smart growth plans and its smart growth concepts and designated environmental protection zones with the Save Our Springs Alliance and all of that, there was already a very intentional decision made on the part of city leadership, on the part of the downtown business community and the environmentalist community, that West Austin was going to be protected, that there was that the neighborhoods in West Austin that house affluent white suburbs are the neighborhoods that can see the least density, the least growth and change, and that the city's policy was very intentionally and deliberately to stack new development in what was called the desired development zone, and that is central East Austin. So there was very much an intentional policy to say, this is where all the density goes, this is where all the growth goes, it goes in this one. So we see constant, we're constantly, and now here we are in 2021, and the city is, due to what I think was an unfortunate new law that was passed through Proposition B, which now criminalizes the existence of people who do not have housing in public. It criminalizes their ability to exist somehow. And so now, as a result of that, we're having debates about, well, where do we place designated cap sites throughout the city? And once again, we see recast that same theme, that same story, and we see an abundance of potential cap sites in East Austin and central East Austin and South Austin, and very, very few, if any, cap sites in the districts that are in West Austin and central West Austin. So, I'm not entirely sure where we go from here, unless as a city we can somehow, as a population, we could somehow choose to move away from this place, where it's just about protecting my neighborhood, keeping undesirable elements out of my neighborhood, and where we can actually somehow find ways to transform our built environment.
That's what I want to talk about in terms of, Joao, how do we turn Austin from this racially segregated, economically segregated, unequal, siloed community into a leader nationally in terms of housing? And how does that look? What are policies that you would suggest city council, mayor, but also business, venture capital, Silicon Hills here could do to desegregate the city, to have equitable gentrification? So that means investment, but not flight and dispersal. So we invest in the East Side, we invest in historic Black and Brown communities here, and you're going to have more whites who come into the community too. But that's a recipe for racial integration and not disaster and conflict if it was done correctly. And we also, for people who are less fortunate, pay their property taxes, allow them to have their homes remodeled and invested in on the city's dime. Part of that would be as repair for what happened in the past, right? So what are some policy right now that we could do that would even counter Prop B and take us in a new direction as a model nationally?
Wow, there's so much to that question. It's a rich question, and the idea of being a leader nationally is really the tall order for us right now. I think structurally, one of the most transformative things that we could do in Austin is relook at our land development code and our citywide zoning laws, which at the moment is very difficult. The city tried a number of times and that has constantly failed. And one of the things that AJC has advocated for very heavily is, can we revisit we need to revisit our comprehensive zoning, and do so in a way that's actually equitable, right? That addresses that history that constantly tries to stack all development and change and density in one part of the city, and open opportunities for new housing in other parts of town, as well as, and accompanying that, we also looked at policies like you mentioned, right to stay, right, which are policies to help legacy neighborhood residents to be able to stay in neighborhoods where home values are skyrocketing.
Yes.
But right to stay doesn't only have to mean that. Right to stay can also mean the ability to, for instance, choose to sell my house and cash in on some of that wealth, but have a place to stay on the same lot? Can I subdivide my lot? Can I somehow participate in that wealth building without being forced to choose between the wealth and the neighborhood that I am historically tied to? And then, of course, there has to be a right to return policy, and right to return should be, we argue that it should be something broader than the street, and even intergenerational. So maybe a family that has chosen to leave Austin and move to Round Rock or somewhere further away, they might not immediately be ready to move back, but their children be interested in coming back to Austin and accessing opportunities that are closer to University of Texas and different educational opportunities and so forth. And so could that be done not by saying so much a right to return to your individual street or neighborhood, but a broader right to return to an area in Austin that you have historic ties to, and can that be intergenerational? And there are ways to do that. I mean, one way is that we could create lists, we could curate lists of folks who have those ties, and we could make sure that they are, always first to access new affordable development projects and so forth. And we could continue to brainstorm ideas. There's lots and lots of stuff on the table. But at some point we are going to have this conversation that moves beyond, just protecting my neighborhood and my own little siloed street, and thinking about, well, this is a city-wide problem and we're going to need city-wide fixes.
Well, I
so much more.
This is such a rich conversation. We didn't even get a chance to talk about evictions, and I know AJC and you've been working on preventing evictions during the pandemic, and really even after the pandemic. The stimulus has not given families who are poor, people of color, people who live precarious economic lives, even with the legislation that's been passed, the footing that they need. So there's so much work to be done, so much appreciation and admiration for all the work you're doing and that AJC is doing. We've been having this conversation with Joao Paulo, who is Director of Housing and Community Development at the Austin Justice Coalition, one of the grassroots organizations that are making big changes and strides in trying to end systemic racism and inequality and violence in Austin, and turn Austin into the beloved community that we know it can be and that we all aspire to be. So Joao, thank you so much for having this conversation with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I'm a huge fan of your work, and it's awesome to be here having this conversation. I hope that we can do more of this moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
We're here with my friend, Brett Hurt, who's the CEO of Data.World here in Austin, and an entrepreneur who's very interested in issues of equity, racial justice, entrepreneurship for diverse communities of color. Brett, my friend, thank you for joining me to have this conversation.
Thank you so much, my friend. It's a real pleasure to be here with you always. Really appreciate our friendship and how much we've been able to collaborate over the past few years.
Now, Brett, you've been in this space of being an entrepreneur really your whole life. I want us to talk about Black entrepreneurship, because as you know, many people perhaps don't, there's a history of Black entrepreneurs in the United States, both during racial slavery and after. But when we think about the 21st century, and this wealth gap. Part of the biggest issues that we face in terms of equity in the country is this wealth gap. What can we do? And you can talk about your own personal experiences, but what do you think we can do policy-wise, and just even here in Austin, to really diminish that wealth gap? Because we are a hub of entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, venture philanthropists, private equity, hedge funds, and big business and corporations. We've got Michael Dell here. We've got Apple. We've got Elon Musk coming. So what can we do vis-a-vis building up generational wealth in Black and brown communities of color?
Yeah, sure, Peniel. So first of all, I think it's imperative and it's an American duty, it's a patriotic duty to become educated on our history. And there's no reason to be afraid of this education. There's a documentary that I watched just 2 days ago. I'm constantly pushing my own education called Boss, the Black Experience in Business. And you can find it on pbs.org. I think Prime Video carries it, a number of others. And it's an amazing documentary about how much Black Americans have had to overcome in our country when it comes to business and becoming entrepreneurs. It's a story of people like Ursula Burns, who was the first Black female CEO, and so far the only Black female CEO in Xerox's history, that started out as an intern, and how she climbed her way up to eventually be the assistant to the CEO, and eventually decided, hey, I probably could run this company. I kind of know what to do now, and was promoted to do that. And it's a story of so many Black entrepreneurs who had to overcome so much systemic oppression and became some of the most amazing entrepreneurs that we've ever seen in America. The first ever female self-made millionaire in America was a Black American woman.
Yeah, Madam
Think
C.J.
about
Walker.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an amazing history of struggle and overcoming that struggle. And it's very inspiring. You know, as a self-made entrepreneur myself, it's incredibly inspiring to see entrepreneurs who have faced any level of challenge and then overcome that. But let's be honest, Black entrepreneurs have faced a lot more challenge than white entrepreneurs. This is a country that is predominantly controlled by white Americans. White Americans are 72% of the population. And I don't say any of this to inflict any sense of white guilt. That's not a productive way to look at things. The productive way to look at things is say, okay, there has been this systemic oppression. There remains systemic oppression in our country. Look at what Texas is trying to do right now with voter suppression laws on the back of the pandemic and the fact that Texas is only number 45. We're in the bottom 10% in the country, including in 2020 for voter turnout. So this type of systemic oppression is still with us. And the more educated you become on our history, the more it motivates you and definitely motivates me to do something about it. Just like if you saw anybody being held down, whether it was women not having the right to vote in our country, whether it was Black Americans not having the right to vote, whether it's immigrants coming here that just need kind of a hand, that, you know, they've left their homeland, they've come to our homeland to say, we're gonna live the American dream. And sometimes they just need a little bit of help. We all need a little bit of help. My success stands on the shoulders of many giants who have helped me, including my parents. Although, you know, when Deborah and I got married, I had $1,000 and she had $2,000. Our parents never gave us money and we had to make it ourselves. Now, this country, there was a lot of things going our way because of the color of our skin, just the pigment in our skin, but we're all human beings. And what we ultimately need to do is, once you get educated, because education will motivate you, just like any education you've had. Think about your college degree or, you know, books you've read that really motivate you. Sometimes comedians can motivate you by telling the truth, and making you laugh at the same time.
But Brett, I want to get
very effective.
I want to get into the granular space of what can we do here in Austin, right?
Yeah.
To bend that curve in terms of generational wealth. We have Silicon Hills here in Austin. We have all these venture capitalists. We have companies like Data.World. What can be done to transform both the supply chain of power and privilege and wealth creation that Silicon Hills creates here? from
Yeah, so
both
so
public
to
and private.
Yeah, so once you become educated, then you're motivated and it'll stick. It's like being educated on anything, it makes it stick. And it makes you say, I'm going to work to write this in the system. And so for Data.World, what that means is it means getting out of our own immediate bubble. It means getting into the Black and Brown communities and the many organizations that are set up to lift up their fellow brothers and sisters, and getting involved and lending a helping hand and saying, hey, we're just here to help. We're not here to cast any kind of judgment or anything else. Just tell us how we can help your organization. And ultimately that leads to all types of ripple effects. It leads to Data.World becoming one of the most diverse tech companies in Austin. We are actually one of the most already right now. Around 50% of Data.World is either female or minority. That makes us stronger. It means getting involved in all types of projects and initiatives which are focused on lifting up Black and Brown entrepreneurs and other people of color that aren't entrepreneurs, that are just aspiring to go work in tech. It means working with people like Dr. Colette Pierce-Burnett, who's a very good friend of both of ours.
Yeah.
And we've been working with Houston Tillotson, and it's great that they have a computer science program now. Now, the sad thing is that's only been for the past few years. And this university is older than UT Austin. Think about that. It was older than UT Austin, just now has a computer science program. It's a historical, Black university. And so it means getting involved and really putting money where your mouth is, putting your time where your mouth is.
And that's what I want to, my final question, because we don't have that much time, is how do we incubate that next generation of Black and Brown entrepreneurs here in Austin, very specifically, because I have students who ask me, and young entrepreneurs who ask me, because they see me around town, how do they get access really to people like you? How do they get access to be mentored?
Yeah.
How do they get access to be on boards, nonprofit but for-profit boards? How do they get access to IPOs? How do they get access, to really wealth creation? How do we plant those seeds, let them flower? So we'll have a whole class, a whole generation, Black and Brown entrepreneurs, who then in turn are going to pay it forward, right? Because that's what we're trying to do. Who then in turn are going to pay it forward. What can we do?
Yeah, well, you'll remember that I recruited you first to our advisory board, and then you recruited me to your advisory board. And so we're already helping each other. And what it means very specifically is it means realizing that there is a power structure in this country and being very explicit and deliberate about providing access. So I spend a lot of time speaking on this topic, a lot of time lending a hand out there, a lot of time focused, as my wife and I outside of Data.World have Hurt Family Investments, a lot of time focusing on investing in Black entrepreneurs and people of color and female entrepreneurs, and giving them the access that I've worked hard to build up. And some of that has come my way because of the color of my skin. And look, I'll take any advantage I can take, but I also will give that advantage to as many people that want it, that have, in my opinion, the right stuff to be an entrepreneur, which is not anything about the color of your skin. As Boss, the Black Experience in Business, that documentary explains, it's all about your grit and your motivation, your drive, your mission, your desire to change the world. So it's being very deliberate about providing that access. And I've got a lot of, fellow white brothers who are doing that, from Dan Graham at Notley, who's very deliberately going out there and giving access with Notley, Josh Baer at Capital Factory, which is like Data.World, a proud B corporation that's going out there and giving that access and partnering with people like Preston James of Div Inc. And it's being very deliberate about that. And, you know, that's just such an awesome feeling when you do that, because to give is, you know, I'm Jewish, and one of the things in Judaism is to give is also to receive. You don't give to receive, but there's an old, you know, proverb in the Talmud that the giver actually gets more than the receiver because of karma. And it just feels great to give access. I mean, I can't stress that enough. We're not a country that should be focused on winner take all or zero sum. We are, you know, a country where the more access you give and the more you focus on this, the more it lifts all boats. And we've seen that throughout history. I've made this point when I'm fighting these oppressive, you know, voter restriction laws in Texas, that show me a time in history where we gave women the right to vote, or we gave people of color the right to vote, and that led us to a worse place as a democracy. I mean, we're the fastest, you've been, you know, one of the fastest growing economies, we're the largest economy in the world. Every time we've given access as a country or as individuals, it's lifted all boats. It's made everything better for everybody, including white people. I mean, that's the
message that we have to share. I could talk to you about this all day. You know, I want to thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your service-oriented leadership. I think one example that we've seen when we think about Black entrepreneurs that's been very, very heartening is the entrepreneurs who spoke out against voter suppression in Georgia and other states. So one thing about building up this Black generational wealth, it always is supposed to be in service of a larger ideal. And I think that ideal is our faith, our family, our entire society collectively. So it's really important. When we think about generational wealth, it's not just to create wealth for the sake of wealth, it's to create wealth to provide and enhance people's lives, opportunity, eradicate things like poverty, homelessness, eradicate inequality. So creating wealth in this context means getting us all closer to a just world, a more just world.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And that is the great arc of history in our country. And I just want to say, you know, thanks so much for our friendship. I love learning from you. I love learning with you. And you know, one of my greatest joys of this pandemic, which has had its many challenges, is that you and I have become such good friends over the past couple of years. And we're really out there, you know, fighting the fight together to make the whole country better for everybody, every color, every race, and every gender. And that's what it's all about.
Absolutely. We're here trying to build a beloved community. Thank you, my friend. Been talking with Brett Hurt, CEO of Data.World, about generational wealth and building up Black wealth and building up that wealth in service of transforming this country and challenging inequality. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, what a tremendous program. I am so proud and honored to have been a part of this exciting day. Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers who gifted us with their wisdom. Thank you to all of our sponsors, Data.World, Notley, and IBM, for their generosity of spirit and their leadership. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy and the LBJ School of Public Affairs, especially Emily Dunkley, Tori Hugh, Laura McDonald, and Dean David Springer. Thank you to the CSRD Advisory Board for your wisdom, your generosity, and your leadership. And thank you to all of our supporters at the University of Texas and nationally. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next year in person.